The NRA, since the late 1960s, has become the chief defender, chief advocate on behalf of Second Amendment rights in this country. The NRA was formed right after the Civil War, but between the 1870s and 1969 and 1970, the NRA didn't have a lobbyist. We never endorsed a candidate. We didn't spend any money on politics because we didn't have to. Prior to the culture wars of the late 1960s, most Americans, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, conservatives, moderates, or liberals, actually thought that the founders meant what they said when they adopted the Second Amendment to the Constitution. So that life members of the NRA included everybody from Theodore Roosevelt to Dwight Eisenhower to Hubert Humphrey and John Kennedy. It was in the late 1960s that things began to change, and under the Johnson administration and with the new developing cultural liberalism in the country, guns and, more importantly, the people that were in the gun culture, as they like to describe it, became targets and enemies. So that in 1968, the Johnson administration forced through what was known as the Gun Control Act of 1968, a bill that Senator Edward Kennedy said was a good first step toward eliminating firearms in the United States. Richard Nixon's Attorney General, 2 years later, proposed a plan that would have eliminated the private ownership of handguns by 1983. And if you had asked anyone at that time that was involved, whether in 2012 49 states would have concealed carry laws, that many states would have the Castle Doctrine, that there would be more firearms activity in the country and a healthier Second Amendment than we had in our history, or that the Supreme Court would have actually finally declared that the founders did indeed mean what they said when they adopted the Bill of Rights after the Constitution, they would have said that you were crazy. But it was shortly thereafter that the NRA became the new NRA, and in the early 1970s established what became the Institute for Legislative Action, which is the political and lobbying arm of the National Rifle Association. And you know, changing institutions is tough. When it was decided that this new challenge faced us, the old board decided they wanted to move the organization to the Midwest and make it into a conservation group because they thought that politics was tacky. But our membership said, you better get involved, because if you don't, none of the other things that you do are going to be possible. And as a result of that, the NRA became very quickly what it is today. At that time, I was working in the Nixon White House for then Vice President Spiro Agnew. We didn't have all the technological stuff that we have today, but the prime sponsor in the United States Senate of the Gun Control Act of 1968 was a senator by the name of Joe Tidings from Maryland. And Joe Tidings looked at a poll. Politicians like to look at polls and almost universally misread them. He looked at the polls that were being taken as he faced re-election in Maryland, and they said that most people at that time in Maryland favored gun control, which is what they referred to in those days. And so he said, why should I run from this? And he ran a campaign with television ads in the Baltimore and Washington markets, touting the fact that it was he, Joe Tidings, who had been the sponsor of this great Gun Control Act of 1968. That was the first trophy put on the wall by the new gun movement, by the new Second Amendment movement. And I remember being in the White House in the office of Chuck Colson, who died a couple of weeks ago. And in the midst of Election Day, he said, what's going on in Maryland? And as I say, we didn't have all this technological ability to analyze and predict everything. So somebody got on the phone and called somebody in Maryland, and the fellow said, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I can tell you this. Our reports from outside Baltimore itself say that there are long lines of pickup trucks at the polls, and they all have gun racks in the back windows. Joe Tidings was not reelected that day. By 2000, the NRA's influence was such that Bill Clinton would say that gun owners cost Al Gore the the electoral votes of 5 states and the presidency of the United States. And in a overt sense, at least, most liberal politicians decided it was time to take guns off the table and do what Barack Obama is trying to do, which is to say, as he promised Sarah Brady, to proceed to deliver on his anti-gun promises, but to do so under the radar, if possible, because the electorate is not exactly friendly. The NRA spent a lot of effort in Wisconsin targeting different groups, but particularly targeting union members who are gun owners and hunters. And in the election, the recall election earlier this week, I believe that Scott Walker, in facing a recall generated by union bosses, received more labor votes than he had when he ran for election in the first instance. In this poll that I referred to earlier, and we're going to get to this in a little bit, but if you look at one of the questions they asked was of people who are part of, agree with, don't agree with, strongly disagree with the whole Tea Party movement, that those who are involved in that movement are also very, very strong supporters of Second Amendment rights and familiar with those rights. I mentioned Indiana because our next speaker, Bill Dowden, is from Indiana. We've just been involved in a race out there. You know, the NRA is a nonpartisan, bipartisan organization. We ask of those we support or those we oppose what their position is on the issues of concern to those who care about the Second Amendment. We were very involved recently in a primary in Indiana against an incumbent Republican United States Senator who, from our standpoint, thankfully lost his primary because he was probably the single most anti-Second Amendment Republican senator in the 4 years. When I have to tell a story, when I was elected to the presidency of the National Rifle Association at our annual meeting in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, and there was in attendance a member of the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania who asked if I could stop in Harrisburg on my way home because he wanted to show me the Supreme Court chambers, which is regarded by the Smithsonian as the most beautiful state Supreme Court chamber in the country. And after seeing it, I can attest to the fact that it probably is, though I haven't seen all of the other 49. He said the court would be in session, but I should stop, and they would take me to the Justice's Lounge, and then they'd call a recess so they could take me on this tour. And I went there, and they indeed did call a recess, and the justices came out, and then the justice who'd invited me said, "Gentlemen, disrobe." And they opened their robes, and 5 of them were carrying firearms, which is different from Illinois. And I said, I understand that contempt of this court is a very serious offense.